University of Edinburgh, and we are very honored of having you all here today, and we would like to thank you for your big interest and great participation. Our student chapter has the aim to encourage students to be involved in fire safety, promote collaboration between universities and industry, and encourage networking. I would like to deeply thank the Institution of Civil Engineers, which always supports our student chapter and sponsor our events. Moreover, the Institution of Structural Engineers, the International and UK SFPE, and the Fire Group of the University of Edinburgh help us promoting our evening talk. This event would have not been possible without the contribution of this great student chapter committee, composed of Chris Bateman, Yorgos Kanellopoulos, Vasilis Koutsoumarkos, and then Felix Wiesner. And it was an incredible experience for me to collaborate in the last year with these great people, and I will always support the future committees. With my great pleasure, today I introduce Professor José Torero. He has immediately accepted our invitation, and we are very honored to have him here this evening. Professor Torero is the head of the Department of Civil, Environmental and Geomatic Engineering at the University College of London. He took his appointment after 2 years as the John Bryan Chair in the Department of Fire Protection Engineering and Director of the Center for Disaster Resilience in the University of Maryland. He was the head of School of Civil Engineering at the University of Queensland, and he directed the PRE Center for Fire Safety Engineering here in Edinburgh from 2004 to 2012. In his presentation, he will answer some of the questions as: when did fire safety engineering started as discipline? Who were the people at its origin? And who are the innovators today? I leave the floor to Professor Torero, and thank you all once again.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. You can only imagine how great of a pleasure it is to be here. I used to teach first year undergraduate civil engineering in this same lecture, about 15 years ago at least. And now it's all refurbished and nice looking, but the place is exactly the same thing as we. And Edinburgh is in many ways the most important place in my professional career, and also from a personal perspective, a place where I spent an absolutely enormous amount of wonderful times. And so it is really a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for coming to listen to this talk. Is there something in between? Fix it. Okay, well, so this is a health and safety issue that is too dark for people to walk out. Anyway, so what is this talk about? I decided to put a fancy title in there, talking about guided by the light of knowledge continuity. And this is a picture of the Battersea power station in London, where you can actually see the magnitude of what construction is today and the kind of problems that we are addressing as fire engineers on an everyday basis. Now, the reason why I put that title is because I think this is an aspect of our profession that very few people truly understand, and that very few people comprehend how significant the understanding of continuity is to a profession, and in particular to fire safety engineering as a discipline. Fire safety engineering is plagued with myths. There's a lot of things that people think that we are, and there's a lot of things that people do not recognize that we are. And one of the things that people think that we are is a new discipline. But in reality, we're actually one of the most ancient professional disciplines. People will claim that fire safety engineering started with Emperor Nero, not when he burned down Rome, but when he actually created what was called the Vigilia del Fuoco, which was basically a mechanism by which you actually proactively introduce fire protection into the city, preventing the oil lamps and so forth to start fires in the city, so people were required to walk around the city extinguishing the oil lamps at the end of the day to make sure that this virus didn't propagate. And as primitive and basic of a problem, you know, it is effectively a proactive mechanism to try to control the spread of the virus. Now, that's a myth, for example, that everybody thinks this is a new discipline, and as such that we're immature, you know, that we don't have the structures that other more mature disciplines have, and that is truly, to be honest with you, absolute nonsense. Now, what we don't have is professional continuity, and that's a very, very different thing. Now, let me give you an example. So, in the last 20 or 30 years, when you actually think of innovation in engineering, who do you think of? Mark Zuckerberg? Bill Gates? Who are the innovators in engineering? Who are the people that are actually changing things dramatically? What are the disciplines that are moving so fast that we can barely comprehend where we're going to be in 5 days? You know, the other day I sat into in a presentation of a new program on financial technology, fintech. So it was the president of the Bank of England explaining, you know, how transactions now are done in a microsecond. All these incredibly complex algorithms, data analytics, you know, artificial intelligence, all these things being deployed at a rate that is extraordinary. Sitting on my chair, I was just thinking, and I was just telling myself, and I burn things for a living. Doesn't sound like the most exciting or innovative thing in the world. So why is that the case? So why are we apparently such a non-innovative space? You know, we can compare ourselves with other areas of civil engineering or structural engineering, and people will start talking about concrete. Are you going to say you're going to break another block of concrete? You know, is that innovation? So what makes us different? You know, these are all the things that are actually fundamental to a discipline. Now, there is one key component that is important and we tend to ignore, you know, which is the fact that effectively knowledge is cumulative. So when you enter a brand new field, there is nothing there. It's all about the great idea. Every change that you make all of a sudden creates something new, something different. Okay? But as time passes, and there's been 15 Mark Zuckerbergs and 10 Bill Gates, then it becomes more difficult, no? So if you look at the difference between Windows, okay, in 1982, when it came out, and Windows in 1985, the difference is transformation. You know, well, you see the difference between the Windows of 1985 and the Windows of today, and it's pretty much the same. You know, you still have to reboot it once in a while. You know, it is still equally annoying. You know, the platform of Word hasn't changed a bit. Every time you want to write an equation, you still have to pop a window out. Okay? It hasn't changed anymore. Why? Because innovation becomes more difficult. You have to learn a lot. There's a threshold of knowledge that it becomes higher and higher and higher. That if you don't attain that threshold of knowledge, you will not be able to come up with something new. If I take a group of first-year students and I sit them in a room and I give them a drawing and I say, here you have a plot of land, design to me an innovative roof. Okay, it's a market and I want a brand new innovative roof, a new shape, something absolutely wonderful. What are they going to come up with? The trivial solution. Whatever they're going to come up with, it might be a pedagogical exercise, it might be something that is motivating, that I can use to encourage them to learn more. But they're not going to teach me how to design a unique roof. It's not the same that when you're in a completely new field, and that new field then has nothing, and you're basically doing the first steps. Okay? Now, we tend to get excited by these first steps because they're massive changes. But that doesn't make them more or less important. They're just different. And these fields that are boring, that are moving very slowly, still need the knowledge continuity. We still need to have people coming into these fields, because otherwise we run into a lot of trouble. Why? Because when you look into a system like this, this is not a system where only one discipline is working. This is not a system where only one interest prevails. You know, there's money, there's functionality, there's aesthetics, there's safety, you can name it, hundreds of disciplines. And if we don't have professional continuity, nobody is going to wait for us. If we cannot give the right responses, if we cannot answer in an innovative and adequate way, if we don't measure up to the knowledge that is required from us, effectively we are going to give the bad answer. And nobody's going to wait 3 times for the bad answer. By the 3rd time, they're going to go and look themselves. Okay? And this is really the reality in which we operate. We live in a field that has 2,000 years of history, where effectively innovation is incredibly difficult. Because you have to know an enormous amount of things to be able to have the new idea. Okay? Now, this is something that is really very misunderstood. And people think that we are in a field that effectively we're so young and so new that everything is to be done. It's not that everything is to be done. The reason why that we have that perception is because everybody has moved ahead of us. And all of a sudden we're landing every day with problems that we're not prepared for. We have problems that are being created for us that we don't have the knowledge or the competency to be able to deal with. And the question is, why are we in this position? Okay, and what is the role of all of you in trying to get us out of this hole? Okay? Grenfell was not fortuitous. Okay? Grenfell was a story that was told 100 times before it happens. But we couldn't do anything to change the course of fate. Okay? Now, this is fundamental because that shows very clearly that is our incapability of dealing with these problems that is creating the situations that now we have to deal with. And we have to understand how to get ourselves out of that. Fortunately, it's no longer my responsibility. I'm an old man thinking of retirement. It is up to you to fix this problem. Okay? So that's the message. I just gave you in 5 minutes a nutshell of this presentation. Now I'm going to prove my point. Okay? So if we look at this problem, here you have the Burj Khalifa. Okay? So the Burj Khalifa, until now, is the tallest building in the world. It required enormous amount of innovation. It required an enormous amount of knowledge to be able to come up with a solution. If you listen to Bill Baker, who is the structural engineer that designed the building, he will start by explaining that the project of designing the Burj Khalifa came up in 1998. And the Emir of Dubai wanted the tallest building in the world. So they started developing this project and everything was going in a certain direction. And then all of a sudden, 9/11 happened. People got nervous, nobody wanted such a tall building, and they called back the engineers and say, redesign the building completely. Okay, we want a building that is much, much, much shorter than the Twin Towers. Okay, so they designed the building, and they start building it. They put the foundations, and they did the basic things. All of a sudden, the appetite of the Emir of getting the tallest building in the world started increasing again. And he started calling meetings where he kept saying, let's add a bit more, and let's add a bit more. And the engineers go, well, we already have the foundations. Well, figure it out. So all these complexities were there, and this is a building that fundamentally is a very innovative building in its treatment of wind. It's a very innovative building in its treatment of materials. The concretes that were used there for the first time. And it's a very innovative building in numerous other ways. Okay? Now, did Bill Baker come up with all this by himself? To be honest, not really. So the story starts way, way before Bill Baker, and as usual, like most of these great stories, they always start in Scotland. Okay? Rankin. So effectively, Rankin had developed all sorts of equations associated to fatigue, that effectively were, at the core of some of the solutions that were developed, for the Burj Khalifa. Okay? Not only Rankin was part of the story, but ramping, was followed by Telford. Okay, Telford, everybody knows Telford for bridges, but nevertheless, Telford was one of the most innovative high-rise designers of the period. So before he started building bridges, he started building tall buildings. So he basically developed all sorts of skills on using stone and masonry, for the design of fairly tall buildings of the time. Okay, there's a number of examples all around the UK. Now, but one of the greatest things about Thomas Telford was the fact that he was a pioneer in trying to professionalize the discipline. He recognized that the concept of civil engineering was becoming way too complicated to be treated by everybody. And when he meant everybody, it was the enormous confusion of competency that existed between the civil engineers and the architects. At the time, the concept of architecture and civil engineering were no different. They were fundamentally the same. But it got to the point where technology started becoming significantly different, that engineers had to start developing certain types of skills that were not necessarily consistent with the skills of the architects. So the institution of civil engineers is the first one that appears as a statement of the need of having a professionalized core of practice. And in 1818, this is formed, and Thomas Telford is its first president, and effectively you have not only the mathematics or the fundamental physics, behind the discipline, but you also have the concept of a professional discipline. Now, what is a professional discipline? Is a discipline that is deemed to be so complex in nature and of such social importance that effectively you have to regulate the practicing individual. You're not regulating the code, you're not regulating the way it's executed, you're regulating the person. That person has to demonstrate that they have the skills and the attributes to be able to exercise the profession. It becomes a monopoly. And that monopoly is only for those professionals. So if you mess up, you're judged by your peers. Okay? If you are to be praised, you're praised by your peers. If you're to be accepted, then you're going to be accepted by your peers. And the Institution of Civil Engineering is one of the first organizations that effectively recognizes the need that for buildings and infrastructure, there was the requirement of a professional competence. Okay? Now, following Telford comes Gustav Eiffel. Okay? And this is conceptually the first truly engineered tall building. A new material, new characteristics, speed of construction, issues like tolerance, constructability, it had to be built very fast. All these things enter the realm of engineering and become a fundamental principle behind the design and construction of these types of buildings. Now, a classmate of Gustav Eiffel was William de Baron-Genet, and he was an American structural engineer. He went to École Centrale in Paris with Gustav Eiffel, and they studied together. And then he went to the United States and basically built what is considered to be probably the first true tall building. Okay? Now, the use of cast iron as the main structural element was one of the great innovations of that particular building. So this is a building in the city of Chicago, and effectively is what we would call today probably one of the first true engineered tall buildings. Now, following the Baron was William Ralph Squire, and his great accomplishment was the Chrysler Building. Now, I find there's a quote by him that I find absolutely extraordinary. He gets asked by a journalist, what does he think about the beauty, of that building? And he says, well, the Chrysler Building is like any other Art Deco building. It is a blanket of beauty that covers engineering prowess. Okay? And that is the perception that the engineer had of his own accomplishment. Now, what were the key components of that building? Effectively, that was the first building that actually used a rigid core, and it was made fully out of steel. All the steel had to be manufactured in Germany and it had to be imported to the United States because the Americans at the time could not manufacture the quality of steel that was necessary. Now, this concept of transporting materials from one place to another one played an enormous role in the Burj Khalifa because effectively the quality of the concrete that had to be used, in particular for the lower parts of the building, could not be attained in Dubai. So a lot of the material was brought, from abroad to try to develop, the building. So like that, I can keep going, and of course, then I can get to the famous UoE Arab. There he goes. And have you ever seen this building? So that's the Penguin Pool in the London Zoo, and it's one of the first examples of concrete technology. And you can see how the pool has absolutely no support anywhere. And he was a great innovator in the use of concrete technology. Again, part of the foundations of this particular building. Now, Bill Baker is a disciple of Fazlul Khan. So Fazlul Khan was the lead structural engineer in Escape Owens and Merrill, and he was one of the first people that actually understood the concept of wind and how wind translates into structural form. And this emblematic John Hancock building is a perfect example of optimized structural engineering. People like David Billington from Princeton University will call that structural art, okay? Because it's effectively the ultimate optimization, of the use of structural materials to try to deliver a beautiful structure, okay? Now, at the end of this pyramid of people, where every single one of them stands on the shoulders of the other ones, comes Bill Baker, okay? Now, Bill Baker had to go through everything that was known by all these people before he could actually deliver the innovations that were necessary for the Burj Khalifa. You could have not brought an engineer with zero knowledge and given them the task to design this building, and they would have done it right. Without that accumulation of knowledge, there is no possibility of delivering the level of innovation that this building requires. This is the concept of a mature discipline. This is the concept of a discipline where people stand on the shoulders of others. Okay? Now, are you going to tell me, do we have the same story for fire safety engineering? And the challenges, clearly, are as complicated. It doesn't matter if you're designing a tall building or you are designing the International Space Station. You still need to be able to make it safe. So the challenge is there. It is equally complex, probably more complex. It's much more diverse, okay? Because you're moving from one spectrum to the other of different disciplines. And the physics, the mathematics, the social implications are equally or more complex than you would have in any other discipline. So, do we have the same story? Well, I'm not going to go back to Emperor Nero, but I'm going to start exactly on the same place in Scotland. William Rankin. So at the end, it all goes back to Scotland. It doesn't really matter, how far you want to go. There will always be a Scotsman there making some noise. So you can take Rankin and basically look at Rankin and say, well, yeah, of course, Rankin is at the core of our understanding of fire safety. We couldn't do without understanding thermodynamics. So thermodynamics is at the core of the discipline, and as such, William Rankin could be considered probably one of the fathers of modern fire safety engineering. Okay? Now, Rankin was followed by people like Sir William Congreve. Now, very few people know anything about this gentleman, but in 1812, he had invented the automatic sprinkler. It was a mechanism by which they substituted firefighters when it was too late to wait for the fire brigade. So effectively, these sprinklers were invented in the United Kingdom, and as you can see, they don't look very much like the modern sprinklers, which were invented by this guy called Grinnell. And, but these were invented in 1812, so we were already dealing with technology at the time. Nobody is going to tell me that it doesn't take engineering, ingenuity, and knowledge to be able to deliver that. And this is 1812. Okay? People were already understanding the concept that sometimes firefighters don't get to the fire fast enough, and therefore you need to have a proactive intervention that automatically delivers water until the firefighters arrive. So even that early, we were already developing these type of skills. Then another Scotsman, James Braywood, you can go and visit him. There's a big statue, behind St. Giles, of James Braywood. So he was the chief fire master in Edinburgh. But not only he was the chief fire master in Edinburgh, but he wrote all these books. And all these books effectively showed a number of different principles by which we proactively protect cities from fire. They talk about separation distances between buildings. They talk about materials that should be used in the external facades and the roofs. They talk about window sizes. They talk about water supplies. All these elements that are required for a proper intervention. And of course, its focus is the fire brigade. But nevertheless, he's talking about fire prevention. For the first time, fire prevention comes in as a corollary to all the knowledge that surrounds fire safety. Now, at this stage, the same way the civil engineers were struggling to try to break up with the architects, the firefighters and the fire engineers are considered to be a single entity. So the skills associated to firefighting were considered to be very much the same as the skills associated to fire engineers. And in that process, the two professions or the two disciplines are still married into a single activity. Now, if you look at what Braywood did, so Braywood was originally, his father was a constructor, and so he was very skilled in masonry and all sorts of things. So effectively, he was an engineer to some extent, but his professional practice was as a firefighter, so he combined the two into one. And his books effectively make no difference between what a fire engineer is and what a firefighter is. Now, following Braywood comes Faraday, and Faraday basically puts together the physics of combustion. As Antonio said earlier today, Faraday didn't know any math, but he actually understood physics. He was an individual who had a really strong sense of how physics and chemistry work together, and he said most of the principles of combustion, which is an underpinning science of fire safety. Now, this is no younger than anything that happened in civil engineering. This discipline existed and was formalizing itself in the same period as any other of the engineering disciplines were. Now, this is a very interesting character, John Ridley Freeman. So he was the first person to look into reliability of hydraulics for water supply systems for sprinklers. Okay, that is really his technological pride to fame. He did other minor things. He went as the first professor of sanitation that later became the Department of Civil Engineering at MIT. And among the other things that he did that were kind of secondary, he designed the Panama Canal. Okay? But in essence, he was a fire engineer. As part of what he did was he founded Factory Mutual Research Corporation, and he became an incredibly prominent individual in numerous areas, but at the core, he was a fire engineer. So there you have John Ridley Freeman. And then the famous Ingber. So we're still regretting the day Ingber was born, but nevertheless, for the time, the way he conceptualized structural fire safety was absolutely extraordinary. He managed to establish a mechanism by means of this fire resistance curve that effectively enabled us to tell that no matter what fire we have in a building, that building will never fail from a structural perspective. That single action separated fire safety from structural engineering forever. A structural engineer never ever had to calculate a building to perform in fire again. All they had to do was to guarantee that it was protected and tested against this fire resistance curve. And that was good enough to guarantee that that building will never fail under any circumstances in a fire. All of a sudden, you split an entire discipline from another one, enabling the structural engineers to build as tall as they want. Skyscrapers start pouring out of cities after that because there was no risk of structural collapse. He had created a framework that completely eliminated the concept of structural collapse as a function of the fire by means of a very simple yet practical test. Okay? So, there you go, 1928. How much more formalized could we be? We have the science, we have the practice, we have the separation between disciplines. We have all the components that effectively label a professional monopoly. Now, and that continues. The science continues. Philip Thomas and the compartment 5, Julio Kawagoe, massive set of data in support of building design. Tibor Harmathy, sets of practical calculations that enable, for example, the open floor plan and the design of the modern street layout. Howard Emmons, the development of all the analytical tools that we use today, like zone models or the CSD models, is based all on work by Howard Emmons, one of the most eminent applied mathematicians of the 1940s and the 1950s, professor at Harvard, was at the core of fire engineering. Now, David Rasbach, a practical engineer with a fundamental physical insight, who came here to Edinburgh to start the program that you're all benefiting from. So David Rasbach came here because he believed, and he was one of the few people that actually believed that the pipeline of professionals had to be filled with competent and highly talented individuals. He left his career at DRE, to join the University of Edinburgh as the first professor of fire safety engineering, and basically develop the underpinnings of all the fire programs that came after him. Okay? I don't need to introduce this gentleman, Professor Douglas Drysdale, who actually brought in all the concepts of fire chemistry, into understanding of fire engineering, and last but not least, Jim Quintieri. Now, Jim Quintieri is a very particular individual. So Jim Quintieri was a scientist at core and applied mathematician, educated at the Courant Institute in NYU. He was one of the most famous fluid mechanicians. And he joined the National Bureau of Standards in the United States as a really, really hardcore scientist. He recognized very rapidly that there was an absolute need, to develop tools for practicing engineers. And he devoted his entire scientific career at translating science into practice. At the end of that period, he decided that it was absolutely necessary to bring that knowledge into the classroom, and he moved to the University of Maryland to develop the first science-based fire program at the University of Maryland. They're very similar to the one that David Rasbach had developed in Edinburgh, and very different to the previous program that existed that was mostly focused on the design of fire protection measures. This was a very technological program with very little science that Quintieri brought the science into and completely transformed into a modern fire safety engineering program. So, are you going to tell me that this is the track record of a brand new, recent, young, and unstructured discipline? That's absolute nonsense. This is one of the most structured, talented, scientifically based disciplines that exist. So why do we feel that way? Why do we feel that our discipline doesn't have the maturity of other disciplines? Now, we've proven that that is not the case. And there's Margaret Law. I've given entire talks on Margaret Law, a professional of the highest caliber, a scientist of the utmost talent, and an individual who actually could translate science and engineering into the most spectacular of solutions. So this is her design of the Georges Pompidou. He took the whole framework of the spill fluid and converted it into a design tool that enabled her to design the first fully exposed structural system that challenged for the first time since 1928 the predications of Edinburgh. So, what happened then? When I came to Edinburgh in 2001, the first event that I had to attend in London was the retirement of Margaret Law. Okay? And what happened next? The pipe dried up. So you might think that that is not the case because you're privileged now. So you have people that are professors of fire safety engineering, professors of structural engineering. There's the same thing in Hong Kong with Asif Usmani. Here you have Rudy Yomas, you have Luke Bisbee, you have lecturers, senior lecturers, Rory Haddon, Angus Law, Stephen Welsh, Ricky Carville. You can go to Hong Kong, Prof of Edinburgh, again, another person from Scotland. So as if it's money went there, you can go to Imperial College and you will have another product of Edinburgh here on the right. You will go to the United States, to WPI, you find out there's Simeone, you find out in Walla, all products of the same school. You go to University of Queensland and you're going to find Juan Hidalgo, you're going to find all sorts of people in there. Okay? Why do I claim that the pipe dried up? If all these people seem to be there. At the tail end of the older generation, the baby of the older generation was Hugo Dreiser. Okay? He was the last one. The one that all the Quintiers and Thomas looked as a promise, a young chap that was coming. And then at the front of the new generation are the Luke Bisbees and Luke Leomases of his work. Do you get a sense of what was the time gap? 40 years. That's the time gap. Give it or take 1 or 2 years, there's 40 years of emptiness. What do you think that happened? What is the consequences of that? Why did it happen? Have we got out of this? Are we in a position now that we are robust enough that this field has taken off again? These are the kinds of things that we need to reflect, because these are not easy questions to answer, and they're all based on the fact that we need to understand the role of professionalism in our careers. So if I look at the pipeline, this is what has happened in 40 years, because people are not going to wait for us. So the Trellick Tower was a 90-meter 1972 design. Look at where the egress path is. Can that be more compartmentalized? This is 40 years later. You know what that building is? The tallest timber building in the world. A single stair building, okay, cladded with all sorts of very interesting insulating materials and made out of cross-laminated and glued-down timber. Do you think the technological needs to design a fire-safe building in 1972 are the same as the technological requirements of that building of today? Do you think that the competency of the individuals who could design this building is of the same caliber of the competency of the people that have to design this building? Needless to say, these are the tallest buildings in the world. There's not a single one that predates 1972. Out of the tallest 100 buildings in the world today, 92 were built after 2000. Do you think that the facade systems in these buildings, do you think that the pressurization of the stairs, do you think that the smoke management, do you think that the suppression systems, that the optimized structural systems, form finding, that's what we use now to optimize structural systems. Do you think all these things are the same type of skills that went to the Trellick Tower? Look at this airport. This is what has happened with Istanbul in those 40 years. This was the Istanbul airport in 1972. This is the Istanbul airport today. The biggest airport in the world, one of the most complex cities that has ever been built. And it's not in New York or in London, it's in Istanbul, with all the social complexities that actually that potentially brings. So the challenge keeps increasing, and it keeps moving. And if we don't move, the gap is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the question is, how did we get ourselves into this position? The light is gone. Okay, we're in the darkness of the fog. Okay? And the question is, how did we get here? What happened? Very straightforward. 1818, the Institution of Civil Engineers is an independent professional association for civil engineers and a charitable body in the United Kingdom. They decided to form that institution because they needed to differentiate their professional skills and they needed to take control over their professional monopoly. Okay? Immediately, the architects reacted and created RIBA. A few years later, the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, is a professional body for architects primarily in the United Kingdom. Okay? A few years later, the structural engineers decided that they were a unique subcomponent of the profession of civil engineers that required their own professional accreditations. And in 1908, the Institution of Structural Engineers appeared as a professional body for structural engineering based in the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not taking this from any obscure treatise or document. This comes straight from Wikipedia. And if you go back, you will realize that it's in the statutes or the charter of all these institutions. Okay? And this process continued for years. And as we have progressed through the years, okay, we have split different professional arms as a function of the complexity of the system that was being developed. Professionals claimed a space for them to be able to exercise their professional monopoly. The last one was SIPSI, as late as 1976. So the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers is an international professional engineering association based in London that represents building services, mechanical, electrical engineers, architectural engineers, technical. All these groups of people believe they have their own professional space and therefore created their own professional body. Where do you think the Institution of Fire Engineers sit? What is the year of foundation of the Institution of Fire Engineers? Is it after 60? No. It's as old as the old ones. Okay? It's 1918. So we were established and we claimed our space at that point. But did we truly claim our space? The Institution of Fire Engineers is a worldwide body that provides research, training, conferences, and professional qualifications for firefighters and civilians who work in the fields related to firefighting, the science of firefighting, and so forth. Where is our space? Don't you think that that is blatantly erroneous? Why? The architects have their space and we don't. We kill people. Think about it. Is this our profession? So that's what represents the legacy of Thomas, of Raspash, and of Rankin? Think about it. This is what we call confusion of competence. And this is the reason why we're stuck in a hole. Because we have never been able to claim our space. We've done everything else every other profession has done. But we have never, ever claimed our space. I have nothing against firefighters. They're a necessary profession. We need that redundancy in the system. But there are no fire engineers. There's attributes, there's skills, there's knowledge, there's profile, there's affinity to technical knowledge. There's so many things. that they don't have. None of you, nor myself, runs around picking up hoses and trying to extinguish fires. I don't know if you saw what happened in the news a few days ago. There were some protesters that brought an old fire truck in front of the Treasury. They filled it up with red ink, claiming that they were going to paint the Treasury all in red. So the moment the pressure was put in, what do you think happened with the hose? It flew all over the place. There was an enormous puddle of red water and not one drop of red ink on the Treasury. Why? Because they're incompetent professionals at firefighting. Do you think it's easy to manage a hose? Believe me, it's not. A lot of people have died trying to do that. Okay? So effectively, I am not going to go and grab a hose and try to extinguish the fire, because probably I'll make a mess and I'll kill myself. Okay? So why do they take my space? Why do they have the power of decision making? Why do I have to come up with my design and show it to a person that has zero competence in anything that is related to fire safety engineering? Why do I have to go to a building certifier that has never been trained or educated in fire safety engineering and beg them to accept my project? Why? Because there's an enormous confusion of competency, and that confusion of competency stems from the fact that we've never claimed our space from the firefighters. We have never done that. We have always allowed the fire service to become the competent authority by default, and we have never, ever claimed the space. That's why we have a dry pipeline, because we are irrelevant. They are the competent authority, and an architect can think that they understand better than us how to evacuate a building. Why? Because they're comparing themselves with a firefighter. I repeat again, I have nothing against the fire service. They're just no fire engineers. And because we have not claimed our space, we have allowed this enormous confusion of competency that has completely diminished our profession, has made it very unattractive for universities, for students, for everybody, to the point that we've dried the pipeline. Now, lots of efforts have gone in trying to turn this around, and you are the proof of it. Things are changing, things are being turned around. There's an enormous, enormous difference between now and 20 years ago. But it is now where we need to claim our space. It is now where we need to make a point that this is a discipline that requires professional monopoly. And the firefighters are not the default competent authority. So, how can we fix this? Pretty straightforward. The light is back in the horizon. Recognize the professional nature of the discipline as a distinct professional discipline from firefighter. Pretty straightforward. You don't need to be too knowledgeable or too smart to recognize the fact that we are a different breed. Okay? Let's just make it formal. Define and formally recognize what are the competencies and attributes associated to that professional practice. What does it mean to be a fire engineer? Both from the knowledge, but also from the attributes. You're designers. You're individuals that are there to deliver a full understanding of a building. You have to understand building services, you have to understand architecture, you have to understand structural engineering, you have to understand combustion, you have to understand fluid mechanics, you have to understand smoke detectors. Okay? There's a broad set of knowledge that needs to be classified, and that knowledge is not a model curriculum like in the 1980s. That knowledge comes with professional attributes. Professional attributes of a designer, an individual that can deliver a solution like Margaret Law did with the Georges Pompidou. So, clearly define and enforce boundaries of professional practice. Carve your space. If you don't carve your space, confusion of competency is going to remain, and it is your responsibility to do so. Carving that space is a fundamental basis of professional monopoly, and separating this profession from others because of its own particular and very specific needs. Invest in high-quality professionals, professional education, accreditation, and representation, which effectively means we have to all become lobbyists. You know, we have to fight for what we need. Do you think that any government has invested a penny in these educational programs that today exist? None. Those have all stemmed from the efforts of individuals that have put blood, sweat, and tears to get these programs against all odds. And the reality is that nobody has put a penny behind it. If anything, they've been trying to shoot down all these programs endlessly. Why? Because they challenge the assumption of competency of the fire service. So we have to be extremely careful that we need to lobby to try to get the resources to get this growing to a level that is consistent with the demands of the profession. So all these things are part of the necessity of a mature profession. We're not a young discipline. We're not a novelty. You know, we are not the same as the Bill Gates, you know, Zuckermans or whoever in the computer industry 20 years ago. We sit in the shoulders of incredibly prominent people that have developed an enormous base of knowledge. And for us to be able to innovate, we have to fill that pipeline with people who understand that knowledge. So, we need to implement as many interim solutions as is necessary. Let the government do it. Every single time they tell me, when I say these things, oh yeah, but that's very hard, and what am I going to do in between? I don't care. Just do it. Whatever is necessary, do it. Even if it implies prohibiting everything so that the rest of the people cannot innovate and increase the size of the gap. Whatever has to be done rationally, and whatever interim measures have to be put in place, they have to be put in place. Okay? If we wait another 10 years, all that is going to happen is that the pipe will even be drier, and all that is going to happen is that the gap will even be bigger. So the bottom line is that if we don't start today, the problem is just going to get worse. So at the end, do we know how to fix it? Yes. Are people willing to do it? Well, that's a big question, no? Can it be done? Absolutely. Has the field the maturity to do it? Of course it does. Can we calculate? Yes, we can. Can we be professionals? Yes, we can. Can we establish our boundaries of knowledge? Yes, we can. We can do all these things perfectly well. The question is, are we willing to do it? So, the sun rises. Okay? And at the end, this is the message. Is this easy? Of course not. Okay? It is not easy. This is not an easy task. You don't have a rosy profession ahead of yourselves that effectively is going to just throw flowers and money at yourselves. Okay? This is a tough path, but one that can be immensely, immensely rewarding. Okay? Who has to do it? As I said, I'm contemplating retirement. This is about you. Okay? Has nothing to do with you. Do you have a choice? No. You're stuck. I'm sorry. You chose this path. Now, put up the fight. Okay? You have absolutely no choice. Okay? So, effectively, I think we're living in an extraordinary period of time. Tragedies tend to wake up people, and we have been deeply woken up. The problems that we have today, they're not going to go away. So this is the opportunity that you have to carve for yourselves an absolutely wonderful career. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Do we have any questions?
You're mute. Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you. Thank you. So that was super interesting. You talked about how difficult it is to innovate once the profession is more mature. clearly it's also difficult to carve your space, or more difficult to carve our space right now than it was, or I think so, no, that it was in the 1810s or 1820s. And I guess part of that is people carving your space is a bit of a battle, no? You have to convince people of that knowledge that we have. Like you said, you have to convince people that the knowledge doesn't rest on the fire service, but it rests on the fire safety engineers. I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, seeing as perhaps what happened in Grenfell and what's happened recently with other fires might actually decrease people's confidence in their profession. No? So you're actually going against the current right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to paraphrase Angus Law and Graham Spinardi, who define an expert as an individual who can convince of his expertise a person of power. Okay? There's people that make decisions, and if they anoint you as an expert, then you become an expert. Okay? Now, from my perspective, the difficulty relies in trying to convince that person of power or educate that person of power to be sufficiently competent to understand that you are an expert. Okay? And I think that's the problem that we have right now, because there's a confusion of competency. You know, clearly the people that are the decision makers really do not understand what expertise is. They don't have the competency to be able to differentiate, you know, between the different groups. Now, I purposely did not touch on that aspect, because that is one of the most complex things. When you come in as being the first in a field, you know, it's like a race of Formula One, that you're starting ahead. You're the first car running, and everybody has to catch up with you. When you're the last car running, you have to basically squeeze yourself, you know, through a million hostile vehicles. And I think that's the reality. The reality is that the more mature a field is, the more entrenched the beliefs are, you know, the more complex the dynamics, the more significant the interests that are involved. The field has already been partitioned, has already been settled, and you really have to elbow your way in. Okay, that's the difference. Okay, you have to elbow your way in. 30 years ago, I would have not been able to deliver a talk in a room with this many people. Okay? And that's the advantage that you have today. That this many people are the many people that now come from these programs on a yearly basis. Okay? And the reality is that those numbers are increasing and increasing and increasing, and you have the opportunity to make yourself heard. And I'm not saying it's easy, and it's not easy at all, because effectively I think a lot of misconceptions are entrenched, and you have to elbow your way through.
I could just shout if it's not going on. How do you go about claiming your space in not a hostile manner, but how would you go about claiming your space, which would in a way sideline professionals that are going to be using the systems that we implement, right? So if you're trying to claim space that would, in effect, remove firefighters' ability to be in that space, the firefighters are the ones that are going to be using the systems that we implement and going to be trusting the systems that we implement, not only the public. So how would you go about that in a way that is respectful towards them?
Well, I mean, the first thing that you have to have is that you have to be respectful of other professions that you're interacting with. So, as I say, I repeated several times that I have nothing against the firefighters, they're just a different profession. And I have enormous respect for what they do. So effectively, that's the first step, is that if you have respect for what the architect wants to achieve, what the firefighter needs to deliver, you know, and the structural engineer needs to design, you know, then you start understanding what they need, okay? But effectively, at the end, it is a proof of competence that gives you your space. At some point, it has to be made very, very clear that to be able to provide an appropriate solution to a problem, you need a certain level of competency that only you have, and that the person in front of you actually doesn't have, and therefore they have no choice but to respect you. So the same respect that you're delivering to these other professions is the respect that you need to demand for yourself. The fire engineer that goes chasing approvals and bending over backwards for solutions just to make sure that the firefighter signs is discrediting their own existence. Okay? We need to get to the point where we stand for ourselves. Now you're going to tell me, if you do that, you probably have no business. And it is true. You know, it creates a very unfair competitive market, because the people who are willing to bend are the people who actually effectively end up getting the jobs. But the reality is that we need to stick together. You know, instead of criticizing each other and so forth, we need to really start respecting ourselves, respecting the other professions, their interactions with them, and trying to make sure that we push as far as we can the same respect for ourselves. That's the only way I can think of. It is a matter of respect. Yes.
As someone who works as a fire engineer, I think people worry that they would, for want of a better phrase, this load of firefighters off if they started to find, this is what my job is as a fire engineer and this is what your job is as a firefighter. But I actually don't really think that's the case. Like, I meet lots of firefighters who aren't happy that they're put in that situation, and they either just kind of shirk their responsibilities and say everything's fine, or they feel like they have to prove themselves, and so they look for problems. So I actually think defining your space as an engineer and defining your space as a firefighter, I actually don't think that's a problem for fire engineers and firefighters. I actually think it's a fairly good thing for everybody.
I completely agree. I think that that's, again, another of the myths that firefighters are our worst enemies. They're not.
There's one or two that's
Yeah.
the same department.
Yeah, exactly.
Focusing on predictors.
Yeah, there's always the good, the bad, and the evil. But the bottom line is that I think that if the rules of the game were much more clear, everybody would be happy.
So in Scotland, we're doing lots of planned things about how we're changing fire safety. One relatively good thing that they're trying to do is say, if you submit a design in Scotland, if it's of a certain level of complexity, no one who works in building control can currently approve that design because they're not competent. And they've actually defined what level of competence as a fire engineer you must have to review a fire engineering design. So that, for me as a professional, is great because it means if someone in building control or wherever it is starts giving some views that are a little bit strange, I can go back and say, actually, listen, you're not competent to review this, and here's your own government telling you that you can't do that.
Yeah, so I mean, the wheel is turning, and the changes are coming, and it's hard, and we need to keep pushing.
Yeah, I had another question, but more on the innovation side. You talked about how the gap is widening between state-of-the-art and, say, civil engineers and our ability to respond to that. Do you think the fact that we are a reactive profession and we are not defining the problems, but the problems are being defined by others, plays a big role in that? Do you think that makes it more difficult?
Of course, but you have to ask the question, why are we a reactive profession? Because we're behind. Okay? If we were actually playing in equal terms with all the other professions, we will not be reactive, we will be influencing design. So this is the difference between engineer-informed design and engineer-driven design. And other professions have already adopted many of these approaches where actually engineers with their competency are driving the way buildings are being designed. So I think the reason why we are so reactive is because we are allowing the problems to come to us after they've been created, when in reality we should be informing the way in which design develops so that those problems are never there. Yes?
I think the short question is, hi, the short question is, how do you know whether you're competent? Because I don't think like 2 to 4 years in university studying fire safety engineering will make anyone competent. So at what point do you think that we are competent? Because if let's say a client to come and tell you that they want to build a tall building made of timber, but in the back of your mind you know that there are research going on to see whether it's safe. How do you approach a situation like that where you know that there's probably no solution or you can't guarantee the safety of the building?
Look, I think that there is a slight misconception in your question, which is, when do you become competent? That is a function of the problem that you're addressing. If you have a very, very simple problem, I can guarantee you that a graduate of a place like Edinburgh will be able to address it. Now, if you're telling me that you're designing the tallest timber building in the world, do you think that a graduate structural engineer will be given that building to design? No, they give it to Bill Baker. Okay? Bill Baker is a member of the National Academy of Science, gold medal of instructee, God knows how many honorary doctors and awards. That's the person that designs the tallest building in the world. Okay? Not a graduate. Okay? So the fact that in our discipline we do have graduates designing buildings that they should not be designing. That's part of the confusion of competence. Okay? So the reality is that there is a process and there's an acquisition of knowledge that comes with time and experience. But when you live in a space where people are confused on what competency is, then you have the wrong people addressing the wrong problems. And I think that's what's happening right now. So we tend to extrapolate that. But the reality is that, yes, I mean, because of the situation, we are put in front of problems that probably, as graduates, we should not be addressing. You know, you should be handing those over to the people that actually have 30 years of experience. You know, and they have all the necessary skills, knowledge, and capacity to deal with this type of innovations. So I think we have to see that we have to start looking at the problems in a slightly different way. And there's multiple parallels in other professions that will help us figure out how our role as a well-defined profession should be managed. You know, other professions do it and they do it very well. You know, and we have those parallels to try to imitate.
As researchers, how do we encourage people that are practicing to be patient? Obviously, research takes time, and to answer some of the questions, it does take years and decades of research in order to say something is safe. How do you encourage people within industry to have that patience and to hold back that innovation that is kind of being developed?
That is a very difficult question to answer, and I think this is really one of the fundamental problems that we have right now in building an infrastructure design. So if you look, for example, at the time scales of iteration of an architect, okay? An architect can iterate 100 different types of buildings before an engineer can provide one answer, okay? So many times the engineer starts working towards the answer, and the architect has already moved on to the next design, okay? And so that incompatibility of time scales is a huge problem right now because it's driven by economic pressure. So you have this enormous economic pressure that is forcing the architects to iterate at a speed. And also, if you like computational, parametric modeling, all these different things, basically are enabling the architects to iterate at a speed that engineers cannot cope with. So there's a huge struggle right now between engineers and architects to try to create compatibility of those timescales. Now, clearly, when you run into issues of safety, there is a problem, which is that there are certain things that you actually have to say no. So if those things have to wait for research, because research is not there, or the data, the information is not there, then the timescale acquires yet another order of magnitude. So then probably the most practical thing is saying you cannot do this, okay? And now, obviously, that is very difficult, okay? But when you have an adequate definition of competency and an adequate definition of professional practice, okay, then it becomes a lot easier because the people you're talking with will understand that we cannot give an answer to that question. Okay? So if somebody comes to a structural engineer and tells him that he has to design, a cantilever of 250 meters long, with a beam depth of 10 centimeters, okay, made out of masonry, what is going to be the answer? It cannot be done. Is that okay? Now, can a structural engineer say that? Of course they can. Why can't we?
I also have a question. Do you think that there are inherent dangers, and how do we balance our caution with the need to elbow ourselves in that space? So if we manage to do that, if we don't do it properly, then it would be very hard to change in the future.
Absolutely, and I think what you just addressed is responsibility. A professional should be willing and very happy to take the responsibility for their actions. Okay? So effectively, yes, you're going to take decisions that are risky. You're going to push in directions that probably are going to bring responsibility to you. But at the end, it is the right thing to do. It's ethical behavior, and that's principle, of any professional practice. We live in a world where responsibility is a very touchy issue, and we need to address this in a very, very careful way. And nobody wants to find themselves surrounded by solicitors and barristers, But at the end of the day, the only thing that I can say is that a well-defined professional structure protects you, okay? Because you're being judged by your peers, okay? And they will know when you were negligent as opposed to, I didn't know.
very much for the very, very inspiring talk. And I suppose everything what you said about the fact that innovation effect is also the product of cumulative knowledge, bringing the use. I just put an ironic comment at the end to really get a little bit attention to the students. To say that because we know today that the funding agencies, for instance, in research, they just look at innovation, anything that would drive us to be innovative, and they don't want to listen on any project that is being built on cumulative type of research aspects. So to kind of ironize a little bit the situation, I would say that there is something positive in being considered to be like a young discipline somehow. Because it means that anything that you put forward is being considered innovative and you get the chances to get funded.
No, I completely agree with you, and I think that if you want to use it consciously as a marketing tool, I have no problem at all. You know, but let's not believe our own lies. So, I mean, I think that that's really all I'm saying. And I completely agree with you that the misunderstanding of innovation, you know, is a problem that stems, you know, from governments having shed all the competence. So in the last 30 years, governments have literally got rid of all the competency in-house. And effectively you have individuals with no understanding of research, you know, making decisions of what is innovative and what is not. And I think that has become a very problematic thing that hopefully, you know, in the near future the pendulum will swing in the opposite direction.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
I mean, you know, I know nothing about firefighting.
Then you should not be talking at all.
And one of the things that I probably want to say is that one thing that my opinion is all the things that we probably find funny is that people in power, people in government want a solution to problems very rapidly, very quickly, and they don't understand the complexity. And actually, often they're unhappy to face that complexity, understand that to solve this complexity takes time and effort. And they just want the mass now. And that is, in my view, something that we have to balance and fight against, because it's really common in many areas. You know, today I have examples of people who want to examine tunnel lining with finding faults a meter depth without touching, without doing anything. And say, can I go? And I said the answer is there. It's like magic. You know, I'll go in, pay me some money, and I'll tell you it's there. And then. But often you find out that there's a lot more pressure to deliver solutions without addressing the key complexity of fundamental decisions. If you don't do that, you will never get them. If you get them, you rely and you will never get them.
No, I completely agree, and I think this is why I was making the point that this is not an easy path. And there's a lot of impediments, there's a lot of obstacles, a lot of people that want to drive things in a different direction. And I think that, to be honest, I always feel that it's important for us to learn from the medics and the lawyers who have protected professional practice to the point, you know, where effectively they are almost immune in many cases, you know, to government. So, I mean, I think that has changed a little bit with the medics, but lawyers are still a bastion, you know, that remains. But I do think that you're absolutely right, that none of these processes are easy. But at some point, you know, we have to stand, you know, for our profession. And I think if we keep waiting, all we're going to do is make it problem worse.
Okay, so before leaving, I just want to inform you that next SFP seminar will be on the 18th of November, and it will be by Professor Torero. And then I would like to